disturbing. Tonight, we are plunging into the dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains with some truly unsettling true horror stories that will keep you up all night, if you're brave enough. Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into fear. Now, get comfortable, relax. I've been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for 8 years now, ever since I turned 25 and decided I needed something to pull me away from the suffocating routine of city life. Most people stick to the popular stretches, the Whites in New Hampshire, the Smokies down south, but I've always preferred the forgotten corners, the sections that don't make it into guidebooks or Instagram feeds. That's what drew me to the Wildcat Ridge section in southwestern Virginia, a 40-mile stretch that runs through some of the most isolated terrain the AT has to offer. The trail here winds through dense hardwood forests and over jagged ridgelines that local maps still mark as unsurveyed. It's the kind of place where you can hike for days without seeing another soul, which is exactly what I was looking for after a particularly brutal year at work. I started my solo hike on a crisp October morning, parking my car at the northern trailhead near a rusted Forest Service sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The first 3 days were perfect, everything I'd hoped for. The trail was well maintained, but clearly saw little traffic. Fallen leaves created a thick carpet that muffled my footsteps, and the autumn colors were spectacular, even if there was no one around to share them with. My first camp was at a clearing about 12 miles in, near a small creek that burbled pleasantly through the night. I set up my lightweight tent and cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, feeling that familiar sense of peace that only comes from true solitude in the wilderness. The stars were brilliant without any light pollution, and I fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the canopy above. It was on the fourth morning that I first noticed the boot prints. I was breaking camp, rolling up my sleeping bag, when something caught my eye near the creek bank where I'd filled my water bottles the night before. There, pressed clearly into the soft mud, was a boot print that definitely wasn't mine. It was larger, maybe a size 11 or 12, with a distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. The edges were sharp, meaning it was fresh, probably made sometime during the night. I stood there for a long moment, studying the print and trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen another hiker in 3 days, and this section of trail was supposed to be lightly traveled. But people did use it occasionally, I reasoned. Maybe someone had passed through during the night, saw my camp, and stopped to get water without wanting to disturb me. It was considerate, actually. Still, something about it bothered me as I continued hiking that day. The print had been facing toward my campsite, not away from it. And it was alone. No trail of prints leading to or from the creek. Just one clear impression in the mud, as if someone had stood there for a while watching. That night, I camped on higher ground, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions. I told myself it was just good wilderness practice, but I knew I was being more cautious than usual. As I prepared dinner, I found myself glancing frequently into the darkening forest around me, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The forest was never truly quiet. There were always small sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant call of an owl. But around midnight, as I lay in my tent reading by headlamp, I heard something different. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite at a distance of maybe 50 yards. I clicked off my light and listened intently. The footsteps continued for several minutes, always maintaining the same distance, never coming closer but never moving away. Then they stopped. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, but they didn't resume. In the morning I found more prints. This time there were several, forming a rough circle around where I'd camped. The same distinctive waffle pattern, but these were deeper, as if whoever made them had been moving more slowly, placing their weight more deliberately. I followed the circle for a few hundred feet before losing the trail on harder ground. By the fifth night, I was certain I was being watched. The signs became impossible to ignore. Small things at first. My camp stove moved a few inches from where I'd left it. The zipper on my food bag pulled halfway open, though I always sealed it completely. I began taking inventory of my gear each morning and evening, creating mental lists that I checked obsessively. On the sixth night, my headlamp disappeared. I'd hung it from a loop inside my tent before going to sleep, as I did every night. When I woke in the morning, it was gone. Not fallen to the floor of the tent, not somehow slipped outside, completely gone. The tent zipper was still closed, exactly as I'd left it. I spent an hour searching the campsite, increasingly frantic. The headlamp was essential gear. Without it, I'd be effectively blind after dark. As I combed through the undergrowth around my tent, I found something that made my blood turn cold. Barefoot prints, human but narrow and elongated, with unusually pronounced toe impressions. They led directly to where my tent had been positioned, then circled it several times before disappearing into the forest. The prints were so close to my tent that whoever made them could have reached out and touched the fabric while I slept inside. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a large oak tree, my knife in one hand and a heavy stick in the other, watching the darkness and listening to every sound. Around 2 a.m. I heard them, voices, distant but unmistakably human. They seemed to be coming from multiple directions, though I could never make out words. Just low murmurs that would start from one area of the forest, continue for a few minutes, then stop and resume somewhere else entirely. I tried to convince myself it was an acoustic trick, sound carrying strangely through the trees, but the voices had an intentional quality, as if they were communicating with each other, coordinating. By morning I'd made my decision to turn back, but when I returned to my tent to pack up, I discovered that someone had been inside it during the night. My sleeping bag was unzipped and spread out, though I distinctly remembered leaving it rolled up. More disturbing, my water bottles had been emptied and arranged in a precise line outside the tent door. The message was clear. They could reach me whenever they wanted. I hiked faster that day than I had all week, no longer stopping to admire views or identify bird calls. Every few hundred yards, I would turn and scan the trail behind me, looking for movement. I never saw anyone directly, but I caught glimpses. A flash of clothing between distant trees, a figure that vanished the moment I focused on it. As evening approached, I found myself in a small valley with steep sides and limited visibility. I didn't want to camp there, but I was exhausted and losing light fast. I chose a spot near the base of a large boulder that would protect my back and set up my tent as quickly as possible. This time I took precautions. I strung a perimeter of fishing line around my campsite, tying small bells and empty cans to it at irregular intervals. If anyone approached during the night, I'd have warning. I also prepared a makeshift alarm using my camp stove and a balanced pot. If someone got close enough to my tent to disturb the setup, the pot would fall and wake me. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds and fighting exhaustion, when the first can rattled. Then another, and another. Someone, or several someones, was moving through my perimeter slowly and deliberately. I could hear the fishing line being touched, tested, as if they were trying to understand what it was. The bells jingled softly, as invisible hands explored my warning system. Then everything went quiet. I lay frozen, barely breathing, waiting for the next sound. It came from directly above me, a soft scraping against the tent fabric, like fingernails dragging across the nylon. The sound moved from the head of the tent toward the foot, slow and methodical. That's when they started cutting. The fabric of my tent parted with a soft tearing sound, and cold night air rushed in through the growing slit. I rolled sideways just as a hand reached through the opening, grasping for where my head had been moments before. I erupted from my sleeping bag and dove through the tent door, clutching my knife. In the darkness I could make out shapes moving around me, at least 3 figures, maybe more. They were silent now, but I could sense their positions by the way they blocked starlight. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the undergrowth, following what I hoped was the general direction of the trail. Behind me I could hear pursuit, not the heavy crashing of panicked flight, but the steady, purposeful movement of people who knew these woods far better than I did. I stumbled onto the trail and kept running, using the clearer path to increase my speed. My bare feet were being shredded by rocks and roots, but I didn't dare stop. Every few minutes I would pause just long enough to listen, and each time I could hear them behind me, maintaining their distance but never giving up. Just before dawn, I found a thick grove of mountain laurel and crawled into its center, burrowing deep into the tangle of branches where larger bodies couldn't follow. I stayed there as the sun came up, bleeding from dozens of cuts and shaking uncontrollably, listening for any sign that they were still hunting me. When full daylight finally came, I worked my way carefully out of the laurel thicket and back to the trail. My feet were torn and swollen, making each step agony, but I forced myself to keep moving. I needed to reach the road, reach civilization, reach safety. The hike back to my campsite took most of the morning. I told myself I needed to retrieve my gear, but really I had to see what they'd done. What I found there made my stomach turn. My tent had been completely shredded, reduced to ribbons of fabric scattered across the clearing. My sleeping bag was gone, along with most of my food and all of my electronics. But it was the arrangement of what remained that truly frightened me. My remaining gear had been organized into careful patterns, circles within circles, with my camp stove placed precisely in the center like some kind of altar. As I stood there trying to make sense of the scene, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. On the ridge above my former campsite, perhaps 200 yards away, a figure stood watching me. The distance was too great to make out details, but the silhouette was clearly human. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like layers of mismatched clothing. As soon as I turned to look directly, the figure melted back into the trees. I didn't wait to see if there were others. The hike out was a nightmare of pain and paranoia. Every sound made me freeze and listen. Every shadow could hide a watcher. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, ignoring my torn feet and the growing exhaustion that made me stumble frequently. It was nearly dark when I finally reached the trailhead parking area. My car sat alone under the rusted Forest Service sign, exactly where I'd left it a week earlier. I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. 20 minutes later, I was at the sheriff's station in the nearest town, trying to explain what had happened to a deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I told him about the stalking, the destroyed campsite, the coordinated pursuit through the forest. He took notes dutifully, but with obvious skepticism. "You say there were 3 or 4 of them?" he asked. "At least. Maybe more." He nodded slowly. "And they didn't take anything valuable? Just camping gear?" "They destroyed my tent, stole my food, my sleeping bag, but not your wallet, your car keys, anything like that." I had to admit those items had been with me when I ran. The deputy leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "Mr. Patterson, you know there's been talk about that section of trail before. People camping up there, living rough, folks who maybe don't want to be found." "What kind of people?" "The kind that prefer to be left alone. Usually they keep to themselves, but sometimes..." He shrugged. "Sometimes they don't take kindly to visitors." He promised to file a report and have someone check the area, but his tone suggested it wouldn't be a priority. As I left the station, he called after me. "My advice? Stay away from Wildcat Ridge. There's plenty of other trails around here that are friendlier." I drove home that night without stopping, my torn feet throbbing against the gas pedal, constantly, checking my mirrors for headlights that might be following too closely. I never returned to finish that section of the AT, and I never went back for the gear I'd left behind. But sometimes, usually late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I wonder about those watchers in the forest. I wonder if they're still out there, still circling campsites in the darkness, still testing the perimeters of unsuspecting hikers. I wonder if that deputy ever followed up on his promise to investigate, or if he just filed my report away with the others he'd hinted at. Mostly I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when they started cutting into my tent. If I'd stayed asleep just a few seconds longer, if that hand had found what it was reaching for in the darkness. I still hike, but never alone anymore. And I've never been back to southwestern Virginia. Some sections of trail, I've learned, are meant to stay forgotten. In the autumn of 1967, Thomas Eugene Hartwell was born in a 2-room cabin near Bland County, Virginia. just 5 miles from where the Appalachian Trail cuts through some of the most isolated wilderness in the state. His birth certificate listed no father, and locals whispered that his mother, a woman named Dolores who rarely ventured into town, had lived alone in those hills for as long as anyone could remember. From an early age, Tommy displayed behaviors that set him apart from other children in the sparse mountain community. While other kids played together at the one-room schoolhouse, Tommy would disappear into the woods for hours, sometimes entire days, returning with stories that teachers and neighbors found increasingly disturbing. He claimed to have built elaborate shelters deep in the forest, to have tamed wild animals, and to know secret paths that could take him anywhere along the ridgeline without being seen. His mother pulled him from school when he was 12, citing the family's need to be self-sufficient. After that, Tommy became something of a local legend, a wild boy who some claimed could move through the forest like a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will. Hikers on the Appalachian Trail began reporting encounters with a strange, silent teenager who would watch them from the tree line before vanishing into the undergrowth. By his late teens, Tommy had developed a reputation for petty theft and disturbing behavior. Campers reported missing food and equipment, always taken from sites along the more remote sections of the trail. Store owners in nearby towns complained about a thin, pale young man who would linger outside their shops, studying customers with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his conversation was peppered with odd lies and contradictions. Local law enforcement knew Tommy as a nuisance, but nothing more. Sheriff's deputies would occasionally chase reports of trespassing or minor theft back to the general area where he was known to roam, but they never found enough evidence to pursue charges. The woods were vast, and Tommy seemed to know every hiding place, every game trail, every cave and overhang where a person could disappear. What no one understood at the time was that Tommy had been using those years of isolation to develop a different kind of expertise. He had learned not just how to survive in the wilderness, but how to hunt there. And by the spring of 1987, at age 20, he was ready to graduate from stealing camping gear to something far more sinister. The first signs of what was to come appeared in the form of increasingly disturbing encounters reported by hikers along the Virginia section of the Trail. A solo backpacker named Jennifer Mills reported being followed for 2 days by someone who stayed just out of sight, always maintaining the same distance, never approaching but never leaving. She described finding her campsite disturbed each morning with clear signs that someone had been there during the night. Another hiker, an experienced trail veteran named Robert Chen, reported meeting a young man near the Dismal Creek area who had seemed friendly at first, offering to share information about water sources and camping spots. But as their conversation continued, Chen became increasingly uncomfortable with the man's probing questions about his hiking plans, his equipment, and whether anyone knew his precise location. There was something in his eyes, Chen later told investigators, like he was evaluating me, trying to decide something. When I told him I was meeting friends further up the trail, he lost interest immediately and just walked away without another word. Local outfitters and trail angels began to notice a pattern in these reports. The encounters were always in the same general area, always involving a thin, pale young man with dark hair and an unsettling stare. They started informally warning hikers about the Dismal Creek Phantom, as some had begun calling him, but most people dismissed the stories as typical trail folklore. But no one realized what Tommy Hartwell was truly capable of until May 15, 1987, when 2 college students from Richmond set up camp near Wapiti Shelter, just off the main trail in what they thought was a safe, established camping area. They had no way of knowing that they had chosen a spot Tommy had been watching for weeks, or that he had been waiting for exactly the right victims to finally cross the line from nuisance to predator. Sarah Chen and Michael Rodriguez were both 21 years old and experienced enough hikers to know the basic rules of trail safety. They had hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail together several times over the past 2 years, and their friends and family knew their general itinerary and expected check-in schedule. They were smart, cautious, and well-prepared. None of that mattered when they encountered Tommy Hartwell on the evening of May 15, 1987. According to the detailed statement Sarah would later give to investigators, She and Michael had set up camp near Wapiti's shelter around 6 p.m., planning to stay 2 nights before continuing north toward Damascus. They had just finished preparing dinner when a young man emerged from the woods, walking directly toward their campsite with a confidence that suggested he belonged there. He seemed normal at first, Sarah recalled. Friendly even. He said he was a local, that he knew all the best spots along this section of the trail. He asked if we were planning to stay long, where we were headed next. The kind of conversation you have with other hikers all the time. Tommy accepted their invitation to share dinner, producing his own cup and utensils from a worn backpack. He told them stories about the area, pointing out landmarks and describing local wildlife with the kind of detailed knowledge that only comes from years of intimate familiarity with the terrain. Sarah and Michael found him odd but harmless, just another trail character with social skills dulled by too much time alone in the woods. It wasn't until they were cleaning up after dinner that Tommy's demeanor began to change. He became increasingly agitated when Sarah mentioned that they had told friends about their camping spot, and that those friends might join them the following day. His questions became more pointed, more insistent. Where exactly were these friends coming from? When would they arrive? Did anyone else know about this specific campsite? When Michael suggested that Tommy might want to move on to find his own camping spot for the night, the young man's response was immediate and chilling. Without warning, he produced a hunting knife from his backpack and calmly informed them that he would be staying and that they would be doing exactly what he told them to do. What followed was a 12-hour ordeal that would haunt Sarah Chen for the rest of her life. Tommy seemed to take pleasure in the psychological torment as much as the physical control. He forced them to move their camp deeper into the woods, away from the trail and any chance of being discovered by other hikers. He made them build a fire in a small clearing he had obviously used before, where the remains of previous fires suggested he had been bringing people to this spot for some time. Throughout the night, Tommy alternated between periods of almost normal conversation and sudden bursts of rage that seemed to come from nowhere. He would ask Sarah and Michael about their lives, their families, their plans for the future, then explode into violent anger when their answers didn't match whatever he wanted to hear. The knife was always present, always ready, a constant reminder of how quickly their situation could turn fatal. As dawn approached, Tommy's behavior became more erratic. He began talking about the others who had been in this same spot, describing in disturbing detail what had happened to previous victims. Sarah realized with growing horror that they were not his first captives, and that the isolated clearing where they sat had been the site of multiple attacks over the years. Their salvation came in the form of an unexpected early morning encounter with a group of section hikers who had decided to get an early start on what they expected to be a long day. When voices became audible on the trail above their hidden campsite, Tommy panicked. In his haste to keep his victims quiet, he made the mistake of turning his back on Michael, who managed to break free and run toward the voices, screaming for help. The resulting confrontation was brief but decisive. Tommy fled into the woods he knew so well, leaving behind his backpack and most of his equipment in his haste to escape. Sarah and Michael were rescued, traumatized but alive, and the long overdue investigation into the Dismal Creek Phantom finally began in earnest. Law enforcement officials were shocked by what they discovered when they processed the scene. Tommy's backpack contained items that clearly belonged to other hikers: equipment, identification, and personal belongings that represented at least 6 different people. Some of the items dated back nearly 3 years, suggesting that Tommy had been attacking hikers along this section of the trail far longer than anyone had realized. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities began connecting Tommy's attacks to a series of missing persons reports from the past several years. Hikers who had simply vanished from the trail, their disappearances attributed to accidents, or people choosing to leave the trail without notifying anyone. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency: solo hikers or small groups, always in the same general area, always people whose absence wouldn't be noticed immediately. Tommy Hartwell was arrested 6 days later at his mother's cabin, where he had returned as if nothing had happened. He was charged with kidnapping, assault, and a host of other crimes related to the Wapiti shelter incident. But the questions about his other victims, The people whose belongings had been found in his possession would never be fully answered. I started this section of the Appalachian Trail on September 18th with the kind of confidence that comes from 5 years of weekend hiking and 3 successful week-long backpacking trips. At 42, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I just needed to be somewhere quiet for a while, somewhere the constant noise in my head could finally settle. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and my therapist had suggested I find something to focus on that was just for me. The 100-mile wilderness in Maine seemed perfect, challenging enough to demand my full attention, remote enough to guarantee solitude, and beautiful enough to remind me why I fell in love with hiking in the first place. The first 3 days were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through pristine forests of spruce and fir, past hidden ponds that reflected the early autumn sky like polished mirrors. I saw more wildlife in those 3 days than I had on all my previous hikes combined. A bull moose at dawn, near Rainbow Lake, a family of loons calling across the water at dusk, countless smaller creatures that rustled through the undergrowth as I passed. My pack felt good on my shoulders, my gear was working perfectly, and my body had settled into the rhythm of long-distance hiking faster than I'd expected. I was averaging about 12 miles a day, which would put me at the northern terminus, right on schedule. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. The weather forecast had called for clear skies through the weekend, so when fog began rolling in on the morning of September 21st, I wasn't particularly concerned. Mountain weather changes quickly, and a little mist wouldn't slow me down. I'd hiked in fog before. It could actually be quite beautiful, turning familiar landscapes into something mysterious and ethereal. But this fog was different. It came in thick and low, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. The forest around me disappeared completely, leaving me walking through a gray void with only the white blazes on the trees to guide my way. I slowed my pace and stayed alert, checking for blazes more frequently than usual. That's when I made the mistake that would change everything. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I came to what looked like a trail junction. The fog was so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but there was definitely a path branching off to the right. I stopped and looked for blazes, but the mist made it impossible to see clearly. I thought I saw a white blaze on a tree to the right, but when I stepped closer to check, it turned out to be just a pale patch of bark. I backtracked to where I thought the main trail was, but in the few minutes I'd spent investigating the side path, the fog had shifted and thickened. Every direction looked the same: gray mist, dark tree trunks, the muffled silence that comes with heavy fog. I couldn't tell which way I'd come from or which way I'd been heading. I spent 20 minutes walking in careful circles, looking for blazes or any sign of the main trail. The panic started small, just a flutter in my chest, easily controlled. I'm an experienced hiker, I told myself. I know how to deal with this. I just need to stay calm and think logically. I pulled out my map and compass, but the fog made it impossible to identify landmarks for navigation. My GPS showed my location as a dot in a sea of green, but without visible terrain features to confirm my position. The information was useless. My phone had no signal, which wasn't surprising given how remote this area was. The smart thing would have been to stay put until the fog lifted, but I was already behind schedule and didn't want to lose an entire day. I picked what seemed like the most likely direction and started walking, stopping frequently to look for blazes and checking my compass to maintain a consistent heading. After an hour of hiking, I still hadn't found the trail. The fog showed no signs of lifting, and the forest around me looked increasingly unfamiliar. The trees were smaller here, more densely packed, and I was encountering deadfall and thick undergrowth that wouldn't exist along a maintained trail. That's when the real fear set in. I found a relatively clear spot near a small stream and set up camp, telling myself that everything would be clearer in the morning. The fog would lift, I'd be able to see landmarks, and I'd find my way back to the trail easily. This was just a minor detour, a story I'd tell other hikers later. But morning brought no relief. The fog had lifted slightly, but I was in terrain I didn't recognize, a dense forest of mixed hardwoods and conifers that could have been anywhere in the Maine wilderness. I could see hills and ridgelines in the distance, but none of them matched anything on my topographic map. I spent the entire day trying to find my way back to the trail, hiking in different directions and looking for any familiar landmarks. By evening, I was exhausted and completely disoriented. I had no idea how far I'd traveled or in which direction. My water was running low, and I'd eaten more food than planned due to the extra exertion. That night, I started keeping a record on my phone, partly to preserve battery by using voice memos instead of the more power-hungry GPS function, but mostly because I needed to talk to someone, even if it was just my future self. Day 4 of the hike, first day lost. I'm somewhere in the 100-mile wilderness, but I don't know where. The fog threw me off the trail yesterday morning, and I haven't been able to find it since. I'm trying not to panic. I have enough food for maybe 4 more days if I'm careful. Water shouldn't be a problem. There are streams everywhere. Tomorrow I'm going to pick a direction and stick with it. I have to hit a road or a trail or something eventually. Day 5 brought cold rain that soaked through my supposedly waterproof jacket within hours. I was shivering constantly, and my boots were squelching with every step. I'd chosen to head what I thought was east, toward the coast, figuring I'd hit Route 1 eventually. But after 8 hours of hiking through increasingly difficult terrain, I was no closer to civilization than when I'd started. The physical discomfort was becoming serious. My feet were developing blisters, and the constant dampness was causing chafing in places I'd never experienced before. More troubling was how the landscape seemed to repeat itself. I kept coming, to clearings or stream crossings that looked familiar, though I couldn't be sure if I was actually walking in circles or if all wilderness areas just start to look the same after a while. Day 5. Still lost. It rained all day and I'm soaked through. I think I'm walking in circles, but I can't be sure. Everything looks the same out here. I'm trying to stay positive, but I'm starting to understand how people just disappear in places like this. The woods are bigger than you think when you're in them. By day 6, I was rationing my food carefully, eating only 1 small meal per day and trying to supplement with whatever I could forage. I found some late-season blueberries and what I was pretty sure were edible mushrooms, but I didn't dare risk anything I wasn't absolutely certain about. I'd heard too many stories of hikers poisoning themselves trying to live off the land. The trial of Thomas Eugene Hartwell was a sensation in the small mountain communities of southwestern Virginia. Local newspapers covered every detail of the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed daily with residents who had lived for years, with the rumors and whispered stories about the strange young man who haunted the forests around Dismal Creek. Tommy's defense attorney attempted to portray him as a victim of extreme social isolation and possible mental illness, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah Chen's testimony was particularly damning, her detailed account of their ordeal leaving little doubt about Tommy's capacity for calculated violence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Tommy was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. As he was led away in shackles, he spoke publicly for the first time since his arrest, turning to the packed courtroom and saying simply, "The mountains remember everything, and they never forget." Prison records show that Tommy was a model inmate during his incarceration. He rarely spoke to other prisoners, spent most of his time in the prison library reading about wilderness survival and local history, and never received a single visitor during his entire sentence. Parole board documents describe him as withdrawn, but compliant, showing no signs of the violent tendencies that had made him so dangerous on the trail. He was released on parole in October 2002, after serving exactly 15 years. His parole officer noted that Tommy had no permanent address and no family contacts, but that he had demonstrated sufficient rehabilitation to warrant supervised release. The last official record of Thomas Eugene Hartwell was a parole check-in, meeting on November 15, 2002. After that, he simply vanished. The first reports of strange encounters began filtering in during the spring of 2003. Hikers along the Virginia section of the Appalachian Trail reported meeting a thin, middle-aged man who seemed to know an unusual amount about their hiking plans and equipment. Unlike the encounters from the 1980s, these meetings were brief and seemed harmless. But something about the man's demeanor left people feeling uneasy. Local authorities initially dismissed these reports as coincidence or misidentification. Tommy, Hartwell would have been in his mid-30s by then, and his parole officer insisted that he had been checking in regularly by phone. But when the check-in calls stopped coming and attempts to locate Tommy for mandatory meetings failed, investigators began to wonder if the Dismal Creek Phantom had returned to his old hunting grounds. Their concerns were validated on August 23, 2003, when a solo hiker named David Martinez was found dead near the same area where Tommy had attacked Sarah Chen and Michael Rodriguez 16 years earlier. Martinez had been stabbed multiple times, his body discovered in a small clearing just off the main trail. His backpack and equipment were missing, and the crime scene showed signs of a struggle that had lasted for hours. The investigation into Martinez's death was complicated by the lack of physical evidence and witnesses. The murder weapon was never found, and there were no fingerprints or DNA evidence to link the crime to any particular suspect. But the location, the method, and the missing equipment all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Thomas Eugene Hartwell had returned to his old patterns. Over the following months, missing persons reports along the Virginia section of the trail began to increase. Hikers who had set out for solo trips and never returned, their disappearances following the same pattern that had characterized Tommy's earlier crimes. The trail community, which had begun to relax after Tommy's imprisonment, was once again gripped by fear and suspicion. Local law enforcement agencies increased their patrols along the affected sections of the trail, but the vast wilderness made comprehensive surveillance impossible. Hikers were advised to travel in groups and to avoid camping in isolated areas, particularly around the Dismal Creek region where so many of the incidents had occurred. But Tommy Hartwell, if indeed he had returned to the trail, had learned from his earlier mistakes. There were no more direct confrontations, no more witnesses who survived to tell their stories. There were only disappearances and the growing certainty among those who knew the mountains that something evil had returned to the woods. The last confirmed sighting of someone matching Tommy's description was in October 2005, when a group of experienced hikers reported encountering a man near Wapiti Shelter who seemed to recognize them, though they had never seen him before. He watched them set up camp from a distance, his presence just obvious enough to be noticed but never close enough for a clear identification. When they woke the next morning, he was gone, but their campsite showed clear signs of having been searched during the night. Since then, the stories have become part of the folklore of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. Hikers speak in hushed tones about the Phantom of Dismal Creek, warning newcomers about the dangers of traveling alone through certain sections of the trail. Some dismiss the tales as typical trail mythology, but others point to the statistics. The unusually high number of missing persons cases along that particular stretch of the AT, and the fact that many of those disappearances remain unsolved to this day. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the morning mist still rises from Dismal Creek and the ancient trails wind through forests that have seen more than their share of darkness, some say that Thomas Eugene Hartwell still walks among the trees, patient and watchful, waiting for the next solo hiker to venture too far from the safety of the beaten path. My name is Rachel, and I'm 34 years old. I've been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for about 6 years now, usually taking week-long trips during my summer vacation from teaching high school biology. It's become my way of resetting, of remembering why I fell in love with the natural world in the first place, away from the fluorescent lights and standardized test prep that dominate most of my year. I chose the Shenandoah section for my July 2023 trip because I'd never hiked in Virginia before, and the guidebooks promised spectacular views and well-maintained trails. I was traveling alone, which had become my preference after too many group trips where I spent more time managing other people's anxieties than enjoying the wilderness. Solo hiking allows me to move at my own pace, to stop when something catches my interest, to truly listen to what the forest is trying to tell me. The weather was perfect when I started. Clear skies, temperatures in the 70s, just enough humidity to make the forest feel alive without being oppressive. I began at Thornton Gap and planned to hike south for 5 days, covering about 50 miles through some of the most remote sections of the park. The trail was in excellent condition, and I was making good time, feeling strong and confident in my abilities. The first day and a half were everything I'd hoped for. I saw deer grazing in meadows at dawn, listened to wood thrushes singing their liquid songs at dusk, and watched hawks circling lazily overhead. The forest felt balanced, harmonious, the way a healthy ecosystem should. I encountered a few other hikers, exchanged pleasantries about trail conditions and weather, but mostly I had the path to myself. It was on the second evening, as I was setting up camp near a small clearing about 20 miles from my starting point, that I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone completely silent. Not the natural quiet of evening settling in, but an absolute absence of sound that felt almost unnatural. No birds, no rustling in the undergrowth, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the trees. I paused in setting up my tent and listened carefully. The silence stretched on for several minutes before gradually, almost reluctantly, the normal sounds of the forest began to return. Birds started calling again, though more quietly than before. Leaves began to rustle, but there was a tentative quality to it all, as if the forest was testing whether it was safe to make noise again. As I prepared dinner, I found myself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. There was no obvious reason for the uneasiness I felt, but something primitive in my brain was sending warning signals. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to trust those instincts, even when I couldn't identify their source. That night, I was awakened several times by sounds I couldn't identify. Not the usual night sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the scurry of small animals, the crack of settling wood. These were different, heavier, more deliberate. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush with purpose, but trying to do so quietly. I lay in my sleeping bag, heart beating faster than it should, listening intently. The sounds would come from one direction, then stop, then resume from somewhere else entirely, as if whatever was making them was circling my campsite. I reached for my flashlight several times, but never turned it on. Some instinct telling me that revealing my awareness might not be wise. Morning brought relief and embarrassment in equal measure. In the clear light of day, my midnight fears seemed foolish. I was an experienced hiker who knew that the forest was full of animals, most of them harmless to humans. Bears were present in Shenandoah, but they were typically more afraid of people than we were of them. I'd probably been hearing a raccoon, or even a curious deer. But as I broke camp and prepared to continue hiking, I found something that made me pause. Near the edge of my campsite, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was a paw print unlike any I'd seen before. It was large, maybe 6 inches across, with distinct claw marks extending well beyond the pad. The print was fresh, made sometime during the night, and it was facing directly toward where my tent had been positioned. I crouched beside the print and tried to identify what had made it. It was too large for a dog, too broad for a coyote, and the claw marks were longer and more pronounced than what I'd expect from a black bear. I took a photo with my phone and made a mental note to ask about it when I reached the next trail town. As I hiked that morning, I began noticing other signs that I'd missed before. Claw marks on trees, too high and too deep to be from a bear. Broken branches that suggested something large had passed through, but not following any game trail or obvious path. And most unsettling, areas where the forest floor was completely clear of small animal tracks, as if wildlife had been avoiding certain spots entirely. By midday, I was encountering the same unnatural silence that had unnerved me the previous evening. The forest would fall completely quiet for long stretches, then slowly come back to life, but never with the full richness of sound I'd experienced on my first day. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook and was surprised to encounter another hiker, a local man in his 60s who introduced himself as Jim. He'd been hiking these trails for 30 years, he told me, and knew every mile of them intimately. We chatted about trail conditions and the weather, but when I mentioned the unusual quiet in the forest, his expression grew serious. "You're hiking alone?" he asked, and when I nodded, he frowned. "Might want to be extra careful over the next few days. Rangers have been getting some unusual reports from this section. Folks seeing things, hearing things. Probably nothing, but..." He shrugged, but his eyes stayed serious. "Just keep your wits about you." I asked him to elaborate. but he seemed reluctant to say more. Finally, he mentioned that there had been several reports of hikers feeling like they were being followed, of finding strange tracks, of wildlife behaving oddly. Nothing concrete, nothing that would warrant closing the trail, but enough to make the Park Service pay closer attention. "What kind of strange tracks?" I asked, thinking of the print I'd found that morning. Jim looked uncomfortable. "Probably just a big dog got loose from somewhere, or maybe a bear with an unusual gait. That's what the rangers figure anyway." But his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. As I prepared to continue hiking, Jim offered one more piece of advice. "If you see anything unusual, don't try to get closer for a better look. Just back away slowly and get out of the area. The mountains have their own rules, and sometimes it's better not to know what's out there." I spent the rest of that day hiking with Jim's warnings echoing in my mind. The trail continued through dense forest, and the unnatural quiet persisted. I found myself stopping frequently to listen, scanning the trees for movement, feeling increasingly like I was being observed by something I couldn't see. That evening I made camp earlier than usual, choosing a spot that offered good visibility in all directions. I was in a small clearing surrounded by mature oak and maple trees, with a clear view of the trail both coming and going. If something was going to approach me, I wanted to see it coming. As I set up my tent, I noticed fresh sign that something large had been in the clearing recently. The grass was pressed down in several places, and there were more of those unusual paw prints in the soft earth near a small stream that bordered the campsite. This time, there were several prints, forming a clear trail that led into the dense forest on the far side of the clearing. I followed the trail for a short distance, my curiosity overcoming my caution. The prints were spaced far apart, suggesting whatever made them had been moving at a steady lope. The claws had dug deeply into the earth with each step, and in a few places, I could see where branches had been broken at a height of 6 or 7 feet, as if something had pushed through the undergrowth without bothering to go around obstacles. As the sun began to set, I retreated to my campsite and prepared a simple dinner. The forest around me was still unnaturally quiet, but now I could feel a presence in that silence. Something was out there, watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't see it or hear it, but I could sense it with the same primitive awareness that had kept our ancestors alive on the African savanna. I was cleaning my cooking pot when I heard the first growl. It came from the forest on the far side of the clearing, low and rumbling, unlike anything I'd heard before. Not the huffing of a black bear or the bark of a coyote, but something deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to come from a chest much larger than any animal I was familiar with. I froze, my hands still gripping the pot, and strained to see into the darkening forest. The growl came again, closer this time, and I could hear the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and then everything went silent again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I set down the pot as quietly as possible and reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to give it a clear target or provoke it into action. Minutes passed. The silence stretched on, but it felt different now, charged with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool evening air, and my hands were trembling slightly as I tried to decide what to do. That's when I saw the eyes. They appeared at the edge of the clearing, about 40 feet away, reflecting the last light of dusk like amber coals. They were positioned higher off the ground than I would have expected for a bear, and they were focused directly on me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. The creature didn't move for several minutes. It simply stood there, watching me, evaluating me. I could make out a dark shape behind the eyes, large, possibly 8 feet tall when standing upright, with a bulk that suggested tremendous strength, but the details were lost in the growing darkness. I remained perfectly still, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting to see what would happen next. I'd been told that with bears you should make yourself look large and back away slowly. With mountain lions, you should maintain eye contact and never turn your back. But this didn't feel like either of those animals, and I had no idea what the appropriate response might be. The creature took a step forward, and I could hear the distinctive sound of claws scraping against stone. It was moving slowly, deliberately, testing my reaction to its approach. When I didn't move or make any sound, it took another step, then another. Now I could see more details. The shape was roughly humanoid, but much larger and more muscular than any person. Its movements had a fluid quality that suggested it was perfectly at home in this environment, that it belonged here in a way that I definitely did not. The eyes never left mine, and there was an intelligence in them that was both fascinating and terrifying. 20 feet away, it stopped again. I could hear its breathing now, deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that suggested it was analyzing my scent, categorizing me, deciding what I represented. Prey, threat, curiosity. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Neither of us moved, neither of us looked away. I became acutely aware of every sensation, the cool air on my skin, the solid ground beneath my feet, the weight of my pack behind me, the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. Time seemed to stretch and distort, and I had the strange sensation that this moment existed outside of normal reality. Finally, the creature took a step backward, then another. It never broke eye contact, never turned its back on me, but it began to withdraw into the forest as slowly and deliberately as it had approached. The amber eyes grew dimmer as it moved away, and then they disappeared entirely into the darkness. I remained frozen for several more minutes, waiting to see if it would return. When it became clear that the immediate danger had passed, I finally allowed myself to breathe normally again. My legs were shaking so badly that I had to sit down, and my hands were trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to wear off. I spent the rest of the night sitting with my back against a large tree, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound the forest made. I didn't sleep at all, but the creature didn't return. As dawn approached, the normal sounds of the forest gradually resumed. Birds singing, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But I knew that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with the wilderness. I broke camp at first light and hiked out of the forest as quickly as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop to rest, didn't pause to admire views or identify wildflowers. I just wanted to get back to civilization, back to a world where I understood the rules and knew what to expect. When I reached the parking area where I'd left my car, I felt like I was emerging from a different world entirely. The sight of asphalt and metal and other human beings was almost overwhelming after the intensity of the previous night. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what had happened. I drove straight to the park ranger station and asked to speak with someone about wildlife encounters. The ranger on duty was professional and attentive, but when I described what I'd seen, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He took my report seriously enough to fill out the proper forms, but his questions focused on whether I might have seen a bear in unusual lighting conditions, or possibly a large dog that had wandered into the park. I showed him the photos I'd taken of the tracks, and he studied them carefully. He admitted they were unusual, but suggested they might have been made by a bear with an injured paw, or perhaps distorted by the soft ground conditions. Everything had a rational explanation, even if those explanations felt forced and incomplete. We get reports like this from time to time, he told me as he handed back my phone. The forest can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone and your imagination starts working overtime. The important thing is that you're safe and no one was hurt. I wanted to argue with him, to insist that I knew what I'd seen, but I realized there was no point. He hadn't been there. He hadn't looked into those amber eyes or felt the presence of something that belonged to the forest in a way that humans never would. The drive home took 6 hours, but I might as well have been traveling between planets. With each mile I put between myself and Shenandoah, the encounter began to feel less real, more like something I might have imagined or dreamed. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, or the way the creature had moved with such quiet confidence through its domain. I tried to return to my normal routine, but everything felt different now. My apartment felt too small, the city too loud, my job too removed from anything that actually mattered. I found myself researching cryptid sightings and unusual wildlife reports, looking for other people who might have seen what I'd seen. I found plenty of stories, but none that felt quite right. None that captured the intelligence and presence of the creature I'd encountered. Friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't explain what had happened without sounding like I'd lost my grip on reality. How do you tell people that you've seen something that isn't supposed to exist? How do you describe the feeling of being evaluated by something that operates by rules we don't understand? Months have passed since that night in Shenandoah, and I still think about it daily. I've returned to hiking, but always with a group now, always on well-traveled trails. The solitude I once craved now feels dangerous, weighted with possibilities I'm not sure I'm ready to face again. But there's something else, something I haven't told anyone. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before dawn, I find myself missing that encounter, missing the intensity of it, the way it stripped away all the trivial concerns of daily life and reduced existence to its most essential elements. For those 20 minutes, I was fully present, fully alive, fully aware of my place. In the natural order, I was prey, and something ancient and powerful was the predator. And for the first time in my life, I understood that this is how it's supposed to be. The wilderness isn't a playground for human recreation. It's a functioning ecosystem where we are, at best, temporary visitors who exist on sufferance. That creature could have killed me easily. It chose not to, for reasons I'll never understand. Maybe I wasn't worth the effort. Maybe I posed no threat. Or maybe, in some way I can't comprehend, it was simply curious about this strange, awkward animal that had wandered into its territory. I keep the photos of the tracks on my phone, but I've never shown them to anyone else. They're my proof that the encounter was real, that I didn't imagine or dream the whole thing. Sometimes I zoom in on the details, the depth of the claw marks, the precise spacing of the toes, the way the prints pressed deep into the earth. And sometimes, late at night when the city is finally quiet enough to think, I wonder if it's still out there. Still moving through the dark forests of Shenandoah, still watching the trails for unwary hikers, still maintaining the balance between the human world and the wild places that existed long before we arrived, and will continue long after we're gone. The mountains keep their secrets, and some things are meant to remain unknown. But once you've looked into the eyes of something that belongs wholly to the wilderness, you never quite feel at home in civilization again.